Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Hello audience, wherever you may hail, I'm your host John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus, where we bring you the most thought-provoking and informative current affairs analysis from around the world. Each episode we invite top experts and analysts to share their insights on the most pressing issues of our time. From international relations and global economics to philosophy and science, no topic is off limits. Join us as we explore the complex and ever-changing landscape of the world, where we provide valuable perspectives on the events that shape our global community. Today from Rome, Italy, we are pleased to be joined by Thomas Fazi. Thomas is a writer and journalist. He was co-director of Standing Army in 2010, an award-winning feature-length documentary on US military bases featuring Gore Vidal and Noam Chomsky. He is author of 3 books: The Battle for Europe, How an Elite Hijacked a Continent and How We Can Take It Back, published by Pluto Press in 2014, Reclaiming the State, A Progressive Vision of Sovereignty for a Post-Neoliberal World, co-authored with Bill Mitchell, also published by Pluto Press in 2017, with his latest book being The COVID Consensus, The Global Assault on Democracy and the Poor, a critique from the left, co-authored this year with Toby Green. Links to Thomas's work will be included in our show notes. But before we start, a shameless plug for ourselves. Please subscribe to our channel. We need the algorithm to find us, and by hitting the subscribe and the like buttons, this is your contribution to the growth of what hopefully will become a South Australian global sensation. Thomas, thank you for joining us on The Focus.
Hi, John. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thomas, I suppose fate has conspired to give us something else to add to our sense of permacrisis with the onset of the 2023 Israel-Hamas war. But leaving that tragedy aside for now, Thomas, you've mentioned the concept of permacrisis in your recent article in Unheard. Can you explain what this term means and why it's relevant in today's world?
So what we've seen these past few years is the emergence of a whole series of new concepts, all revolving around the concept of crisis. So, for example, the economic historian Adam Tooze popularized the concept of polycrisis a while ago. The notion that we're going through an unprecedented moment and phase in history where we have all these crises going on at the same time and kind of self-reinforcing each other, many of them global in nature. And, you know, the idea is that this is just completely unprecedented, hence the need for an actual new term to encapsulate this concept, i.e. polycrisis. But that's not the only term that has taken hold in recent years. Another one is the concept of permacrisis. So not only is this a polycrisis, i.e., you know, we've got all these crises going on at the same time, but we have been in this situation for such a long time, and we are bound to be in it for the foreseeable future, to the point that we can actually speak of a perma crisis, or as some say, a perma polycrisis. And so the idea is that, you know, crisis has become kind of an ontological reality. It's almost a metaphysical reality. You know, we're stuck in crisis. We live in an age of crisis or crises, and there's no escaping it. And these concepts have become, they've been embraced by, the elites, so to speak. And so at the recent World Economic Forum in Davos, there was an entire panel dedicated to this concept of polycrisis. Recently, the former British Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, along with 2 other very distinguished economists, published a book called Permacrisis. And so we can see that, the elites are embracing these concepts. And so I think whenever we see a concept being embraced by the elites, it's always good practice to exercise a bit of critical thinking, and maybe not to accept the the explanation that's provided at face value. And so that's what I do in the article. I just I ask a few questions, and I pose a few questions. And of course, no one would question the idea that yes, there are a lot of bad things happening around the world at the same time, and and it's true, as we can go, if we look back at the past few years, but in fact, even the past decade or even 2 decades, we do seem to have jumped from one crisis to another. Especially, many of these have been global crises, but I would say that there seems to be a phenomenon that's especially true in the West, and this is another aspect of this story. So we've gone from the kind of post, the war on terrorism, the post 9/11 war on terror, and then we had that kind of blended into the financial crisis, and the two overlapped for a while. In Europe, where I live in Italy, that turned into the Euro crisis, the debt crisis. Then there were a whole series of more localized crises. We had Brexit in the UK, and we've had migration crises in various European countries, and not only. And just as we seemed to be coming out of that crisis, well, the mother of all crises hit, the global pandemic, of course. And then literally, I would almost overnight, we kind of switched from the pandemic crisis to the Ukraine crisis. And as you mentioned, now, of course, we have another awful crisis happening in Israel and Palestine. And so the point is, of course, all these things have been bad. And right now, there are a number of problems. Of course, there is the climate crisis, which we had never, which is we are constantly reminded of. But I think, the question is, not that these are not problems, but is this framing of crisis, of polycrisis, of permacrisis, is this constant evoking of a crisis, rather than simply, addressing the issue, this constant evoking of the notion of crisis, does it maybe serve some ulterior motive? Could, elites have an interest in constantly evoking this notion of permacrisis? And there are, a number of ways, I think, in which this concept does serve those who are in power. It's a way of, this constant evoking of crisis, it keeps us constantly, terrified, constantly worried, constantly focused on the present. So it doesn't make it easy to plan for the future, to fight for a better future. Also, and this is one of the paradoxes of permacrisis, which I will talk about, in a sense that it actually hinders, I think, the resolution of many of these problems. It lends people to cede power and to those in government, because whenever you're scared and whenever you think there are huge problems that at hand that individuals can't solve, you are more willing to allow those in power to exercise power in an unrestrained way. And I think that was particularly clear during the pandemic. And so I think, in a way, that permacrisis has become almost a form of governance. I think in a situation where Western elites have become are losing authority and legitimacy, and this has been happening for quite some time now. They aren't able to provide much in they've been able to provide less and less in material terms to the people. We know that people are growing, are getting poorer in Western countries in general, and they have been for quite some time now. Living conditions aren't exactly improving in the West. On a global scale, it's a different story, but it's also part of this story. And they're not even able to provide much in transcendental terms. We're very fractured societies. Our elites aren't able to offer us some sense of belonging, some sense of purpose. And so in this situation, how do you keep the populaces under control? And I think fear is a very effective way of doing that, I think. And so I think, this politics of fear is part of this story, I think. And the way, crisis, or, a state of crisis, it also means that we are in a constant state of emergency. And the state of emergency is what justifies the state of exception, where you can, you can sidestep all the normal rules and guarantees and safeguards that our constitutions have in place, because, if we're facing these huge crises, then we don't have time to debate, to have a reasoned debate, to allow the, Parliament to have, reasoned debates about the issues at hand, because we're all about to die. And so there's no time for debate. There's no time for reflection. There's no time to allow democracy to go through its normal channels, which also tend to be slower than, of course, one guy at the helm. But that's we also recognize the dangers in that system. But that seems to be increasingly what we are, I think, moving towards. And I think this is so this is one of the greatest dangers, I think, of this concept, is that it kind of, whatever situation we're facing, it kind of justifies the idea that anything goes in order to solve the problem that we're facing. It doesn't allow for complex thinking. We saw it during the pandemic. We have this virus, we got to squash the virus. Anything is justified to squash that virus, even if it, means shutting people inside their homes for months and doing a whole series of things that were bound to have that to create collateral damage. But we completely ignored that because, we were focused on, almost monomaniacally focused on this one objective. And in a way, you can see the same thing at play, for example, with climate change. The world's about to end. If we don't take radical steps towards reducing emissions, we're all going to die. And of course, the science is much more nuanced when it comes to climate change. Nowhere does it say that, life on Earth is going to end or that we're all going to die. The IPCC doesn't say that. But this is kind of how it's framed. If we don't take drastic action immediately, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the short and medium term consequences that radical decarbonization could have, that doesn't matter, because anything is better than the end of life on the planet. And so we have these very simplistic framings, I think, which in a way kind of paved the way to authoritarianism, because and we think we're already seeing that to some extent, where, I think we'll see it increasingly, especially when it comes to the issue of climate. And so the question here is not to, this is, when we talk about permacrisis and kind of when we try to give a critical reading of permacrisis, I think that it's important to acknowledge that no one is denying the problems here. No one is denying that, climate change is a real problem. But I think we shouldn't, at the same time, we have to retain the capability to separate the actual problem from the possibility that those in power might be interested and willing in using that, that problem to further, their own agenda, to entrench their own power. I think that was quite clear with COVID. Of course, COVID was real, but I think we saw a lot of policies that weren't purely, aimed at saving as many lives as possible. We saw huge transfers of wealth, huge transfers of power. A lot of people benefited from those policies. Same thing with the kind of dominant approach to climate change. And a number of other issues, Ukraine, clearly, Western support for Ukraine is not entirely disinterested. We're not doing it just, because we believe in freedom and democracy and the sovereignty of the Ukrainians. There are very powerful interests that are benefiting from the current policies. So I think, I think it gives us a good way of looking at reality, I think, of questioning the way reality is presented. And I think it is important to challenge this notion of permacrisis, because I think really it's becoming almost a I would say it's I think it's turning almost into a pathological. I think there's something pathological about it. It's having very negative, I think, even psychological consequences. Now we hear, all these young, that it's becoming more and more common among young people to suffer from, climate anxiety. We hear about young people not have, deferring kids or not having kids at all because the world's about to end. And so I think this is the real paradox. Of course, my counterparts, if I were arguing this with a permacrisis proponent, would say, oh, but you just want to downplay the seriousness of these problems. We're simply we simply believe that these are real problems, and we need to stress how serious they are. But the paradox is that, in fact, I think this concept of permacrisis or polycrisis, it's making us completely disillusioned about our ability to actually solve any of these problems, because these problems seem so big, so massive, so huge, and they're interacting with each other in unpredictable ways, and they're global in scale. And I think that the end result is that it breeds disillusion. I think it breeds depression, and I think it's that's one of the reasons I think why for example, we're not making much progress on the on the issue of climate, for example. We constantly talk about it and obsess about it, but it doesn't seem like we're making much progress. Paradoxically, we're seeing more progress in non-Western countries. For example, China. China is a country that's doing a lot to address the issue in terms of reforestation, in terms of investment in renewable energies, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't obsess about it. So I think it's interesting. This is very much a Western. It's a Western problem. When you look at the BRICS countries, China, India, other major countries, it's not like they don't acknowledge that there are problems in the world. Obviously, they face a lot of problems themselves. In some cases, much more serious problems than we do here in the West. But they seem to have that. They don't obsess about them. They don't fall into this kind of doomerist end of times narrative. They simply they try to address the problems, but without thinking that the world's about to end. I think they have on the issue of climate, for example, they have a much more nuanced approach. They realize that climate change is real and has negative consequences, but they also see that as one aspect of a phenomenon, i.e. development, growth, which also has a lot of positive sides to it. Industrialization, that's what gets people out of poverty, and so it's what got almost 1 billion Chinese out of poverty, and so I think they see both sides of the issue. On climate is just one example, but there are many other examples.
So if I could just ask, do you think we have too many elites in the West and too many sort of elite sentiments? I mean, this is a position put forward by complexity scientist Peter Turchin, suggesting that we've overproduced elites to the point where we can't easily absorb them into our societies anymore. Do you think that this may add to our current societal instabilities, or at least our perceptions of those instabilities?
Well, I think certainly there's an overproduction of, for example, academic thinking, especially in some areas. So the notion that we are, overthinking a number of issues, I think Turchin definitely has a point there. a situation where you have a lot of people in academia that are coming up with these increasingly convoluted concepts and ideas, because that's what they do all day. They sit down and think about these things, and at the same time we have powerful economic and political interests that also see the value in some of these ideas. They also see that having us talk about certain issues rather than other issues is also a useful way to keep people distracted, and to have us talking about certain issues rather than others. And I think the whole notion of wokeism and the woke left, I think that's part of it. I think it's part of this dynamic, in the sense that you take the question of trans people. Now, no one is against trans rights, but it is a fact that the people who experience gender dysphoria in society are less than 0.01%, and so we're talking about the tiniest possible minority you can think of, and yet it has become one of the main topics of debate in the West, in Western public debate. I think there's something absurd about that, regardless of what one thinks about the issue. Is the simple fact that they've managed to get everyone talking about an issue that concerns less than 0.01% of people in society. You can see why that serves certain interests, not to mention the fact that I think it's for example useful to divide us into micro categories, micro identities. If one doesn't think that there's kind of there's a room where people get together and plan these things. We don't have to resort to very simplistic conspiracy theories to acknowledge that at the same time elites have always produced kind of an intellectual consensus that serves their interests. I think there's nothing new about this. Who founded all the great, all of the most famous American universities? Carnegie, Stanford, Chicago University. They were all founded by the robber barons of the 19th century, and that wasn't done simply out of goodwill or a love for culture. They also saw it as a way of influencing the debate. They realized the importance of academia, the importance of social sciences in shaping the kind of the political and social ecosystem, and and so today I think we're witnessing something very similar. And so we have to question again. It's not about people think that when you question wokeism as an ideology, you necessarily have to be a right-wing, xenophobe who hates gays, and that's not the case at all. It's about again questioning why are elites, why are very, very powerful economic interests embracing this concept. Why do you have this big shift towards ethical ethical capitalism or woke capitalism, where when Pride Month comes along, you've got some of the worst companies, worst corporations in the world that exploit workers, exploit the environment, literally make killing machines for profit, embracing, shrouding themselves in the rainbow flag, and engaging in all this virtue signaling. So when you see, Lockheed Martin, opening the Pride March in Washington D.C. with this big rainbow banner,
or missile,
I think we have to question if there's sorry,
or missile,
exactly,
to keep it in that sort of phallic mode.
Exactly.
But yeah, look,
exactly.
Yeah,
very apt. Absolutely.
I think
it is. So we have to question if there's something more than just Lockheed Martin expressing their solidarity with gay and trans people. you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, with regard to all of what you've just said on elites, I suppose the one thing that, the Carnegies of the world and all those other robber barons they didn't have the proliferation of the 24/7 media cycle to contend with, where everyone can get a microphone and just go for it. It doesn't matter how minor your topic is in the scheme of things, so long as you've got this, and so long as we're on our podcast, and so long as we can talk about it and ear bash the other side into submission, this could be an actual problem. Because, when you proliferate the ideas and the elites and where do you go from here? The only thing that you can do in the end is try to clamp them down. So that goes back to what you were saying earlier about fear, and using fear as the method by which we just shut the arguments down. The arguments have become too diffuse. They've become too self-serving, too contradictory. Most people can't get their heads about it. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the average Joe blog sitting in front of his TV watching the 6 o'clock news just looks at it for 5 minutes, shrugs the shoulder and bugs off, has a beer and forgets about it as much as he can, because that's really what the world is all about right now. It's that almost information overflow. The mind cannot process what the mind cannot process, and it's just too much.
Yeah, we do live in I think the internet has changed things in many ways, some positive and some negative. So I think when it comes to, so of course, on the one hand, it does offer the possibility to break the stranglehold of propaganda. On the one hand, before the internet, we had little choice but to get our information from a select number of sources, whether it was TV, radio, or newspapers, and that, of course, so long as those in power were able to control, even indirectly, those publications, those media outlets, it was fairly easy to control the narrative. Of course, the internet completely breaks that up. It suddenly everyone can reach anyone else, and anyone can access any form of information. I think they realized the powers that be, they realized the risks that were intrinsic in this quite early on. And I think they have moved to a large degree to clamp down on that. So if we take, for example, the major social media networks, they exercise very, very strict levels of control on the information flow. So now Twitter, since Musk took it, is a bit of an exception. But, pre-Musk, and we saw that very clearly during the pandemic, the information flow on these networks was very, very tightly controlled, and I would say almost micromanaged. I mean, we know, thousands of people that were, flagged, deplatformed, censored. A lot of it came out only later, mostly thanks to Musk's release of the Twitter files. But all of us had an understanding that this was happening, even though they were denied it. Now we know that the US government was directly giving orders to social media companies in terms of what kind of information to remove, and so on and so forth. And we are seeing more and more laws being passed across Western countries, which are aimed precisely at giving governments the power to engage in disinformation and misinformation, such as in the case of the European Digital Services Act, where it's all about countering Russian propaganda, which tends to be anything that contradicts the Western narrative, especially on Ukraine. So they are clamping down, I think, very, very heavily. And I think the effects of that can be very, very dangerous, because not only because all censorship is bad, but because we spend so much time on these networks that if you're able to effectively control the flow of information on these networks, I think you can control people's minds and even their their emotions to a much greater degree than anyone could have dreamed of doing before the internet.
Thomas, can I just give you a quick example of that here in Australia? Now, over the last couple of days, of course, we had the headlines of the Israel-Hamas war, but as a subterranean subtext to all of that was this constant barrage of information from the National Bureau of Meteorology that keep on driving home what a terrible summer we're going to be encountering this time round, like an unprecedented summer. It's almost preparing us to not even bother to go outside because the sun is going to be way too hot. We're going to have to turn our air conditions on, stay next to a cool drink, and just sit in front of the computer constantly. So I can understand that the messaging does seem so doom-laden now that even what you would consider a harmless weather broadcast in most cases turns out to be doom porn. And many people take this to heart. Many people take this to heart and say, yes, there's another war in the Middle East, but my God, summer we're going to end up having our first 50-degree day out in Adelaide and no one's going to be able to walk in the shade. This is the kind of thing that seems to be driving our mentality at the moment. And that's the media message that's being thrown at us. And I'm sure that, you guys living in Europe, you've just come out of, well, what was a very, very unprecedented unprecedented hot summer. So we've got a lot to look forward to down here once the summer ticks over on December 1st here, so what are you going to do?
I think it's really interesting. I think that's a great example of the political use of crisis. So as I said, like, no one denies that temperatures are rising. Okay. I personally don't deny that human activity, CO2 emissions have played a big role in that, continue to play a big role in that. But that's not the point. The point is, okay, what do we do about it? That's the real conversation we should be having. Not, between denialists and those that, the issue is not whether one believes or not in climate change, is what do we do about it? Considering the fact that there are no easy solutions. If it were easy, if we could just decarbonize overnight with no consequences whatsoever, everyone would be happy to do it. Because so the point is that it's not that easy.
Well, actually, let me take you up on that one. Would everyone really be happy to do it? I mean, when we fail to recognize the immediacy of a problem, we tend to just push it over to one side. It doesn't matter what the political messaging happens to be, because ultimately there is one thing that, subconsciously we are going to be aware of, and that is when Big Brother comes knocking on our door in the middle of the night saying, if you want to live in the better world, you must do this. You've got to get rid of your TVs. You can only have lights on at a certain time in the evening. And then everything else that you have to do is rationed. We're going to take your right to drive to work away from you because, of course, fossil fuels are terrible and we need to get rid of all fossil fuel cars off the road. I mean, we're talking draconian measures here. Right. And I think most people would feel, look, okay, not on my watch, though. They're not going to take my bloody car away from me. And they're not going to prevent me from watching Netflix show after show after show and using my electricity any which way I like. Right.
Obviously. No. But so when I said without any consequences, I meant without any consequences of this kind, if we can simply switch to, 100% clean energy without making any changes to our lives, I think most people would be happy to do it, because, we all experience smog in our cities and cars pollute. And so, if we could all go, to, 100% clean energy, and it's not just about emissions. I mean, it's also about pollution. I think most people would be happy to do it if they had, without having to endure any of those draconian consequences. The question is that that's not the world we live in. Precisely as you're saying, getting there requires either very draconian. Well, and then getting there, it's even questionable whether we'll get there anyway. That's a whole other issue in a sense that all these draconian measures, even if we were to reach net zero within the next decade, which is absolutely impossible, the actual temperatures will still continue rising just by just a bit less. And so maybe in 100 years we will have avoided temperatures from rising. They will have only risen 2 degrees rather than 3. But again, we don't even understand that well the long-term effects of these policies. So, but putting that aside, it's not just about the draconian policies, it's about the fact that as I was saying earlier, energy, electricity, fossil fuels are what have driven, what have brought us to our current levels of welfare. It's what has allowed us to develop. It's what gives us, hospitals and modern medicine. It's what has lengthened, people's lifespans. So, now it's become fashionable to demonize growth in the West. But in fact, a lot of people should go to sub-Saharan Africa to experience what it's like to live without growth and with almost zero emissions. So we should never forget that. And so when we talk of, decarbonize, it's, there's a trade-off in everything. I'm not saying we shouldn't, think about the issue of climate change, but we should be very, very cognizant that there are trade-offs, and we have to make sure that the medicine isn't worse than the cure, because if, as a result of the collapse in GDP, resulting from decarbonization, more people fall into poverty and more people end up dying every year than they would have from climate change, then that would seem a failure to me. Because surely, what we should be, what our ultimate aim should be is to increase, the welfare of everyone, and and save as many lives as possible. So we have to be careful. A lot of these policies can have, very, very serious unintended consequences, mostly in terms of offset growth. This is particularly evident in Africa. Africa desperately needs to grow, and it desperately needs energy to grow, because energy is the lifeblood of development, of growth, and most of that energy will have to come from fossil fuels, just as we have done, because they're the most widely available. They're in some cases still the cheapest form of energy, and it's it's how China got 1 billion people out of poverty in 2 decades. The notion that we are trying to impose, from the West on African countries and poorer countries, that they have a right to develop, but they have to do so, in a green, sustainable fashion, and so they have to leapfrog, from no development to green development, when not even the richest countries in the world are proving able to do that, is really I think it's a disgrace. What we are doing is condemning these people to poverty, in a context in which hundreds of thousands of kids die before they reach the age of 5. So I think this relates to our inability to think about the wider implications of the problem. But going back to what you were saying, so again, no one denies the question of climate change, but then it's at the same time it's clear that they are resorting to propaganda. So we've seen that the colors on the maps are changing. So 30 degrees 10 years ago used to be a nice, happy yellow. Usually it was a smiley sun. Now it's dark red, if not purple, if not black, and there's no smiley sun anymore. This is not accidental. So clearly, this relates. So these are forms of psychological manipulation. So they want us to feel terrified, and and we've also seen them engage. And so in Italy and in other countries, they actually changed the way temperatures are measured. So temperatures are usually measured in the air. So, a couple of meters from the ground, because that's the temperature you experience, walking about. This year, we started seeing temperatures detected underground. And, they tend to be much, much warmer, because the ground absorbs
the heat. Yeah.
And again, and a lot of people, and luckily, even some few serious meteorologists here in Italy were like, look, this is weird. Why are we using temperatures why are you detecting temperature in a way we've never detected before, which will clearly give you much higher temperatures than if you simply use the techniques that we've always used? So clearly there is something fishy going on, and again, the question is, why are they doing this? So one could say, why are they doing this? One could say, oh, they're simply very concerned about climate change, and they're simply very concerned about our health, and so they're simply nudging us a bit, but they're doing it in good faith. I don't know. I think that's questionable.
Yeah. Sorry, Thomas. I just need to ask you this. Anyone listening in may think, and I know that there are people out there that do think like this, and that when you start talking about elites in the abstract, rather than specific government policies. They say, you're a conspiracy theorist, people don't organize themselves in this kind of way. This is all rubbish, elites don't have this sort of evil agenda. They're not all sitting around in their Masonic frocks, summoning the devil. That sort of Simpson-esque kind of caricature of what an evil elite would be. So how do you then counter the skepticism among people who may suggest that what you're putting forward is a sort of almost a conspiratorial, there are these elites, they're all sort of colluding to keep power among themselves to the detriment of, the lumpen proletariat, if you like. I don't know. I mean, what do you say to that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, no one is saying that there's a room somewhere where these satanic elites, these Illuminati, they meet every week and decide the policies for the next for the coming week. No, that's not how it works. But at the same time, we do know that within it's been a staple of much kind of so I come from the left, and so a staple of left critique has been the notion that in capitalism, of course you have of course economic elites and political elites have an interest in maintaining the status quo, and to some degree they do collude, not by meeting in a room every week, but for example by meeting once a year in Davos. So Davos is, if you want to know who the world's elites are, just look, it's no secret. Just, look at who convenes in Davos every year. And, and it includes, the world's top leaders and the CEOs of the biggest banks and the biggest corporations and the biggest NGOs and the biggest media companies. This is, we're talking about maybe a couple, 1,000 people that make up the 0.00001% of the population, but clearly they do, wield massive influence and massive power. And there's not a complete, they don't need to directly coordinate, as in, meeting up and deciding what to do next. But there is, but a consensus does emerge in these contexts. They don't. So there is an element of elite consensus formation that happens and that takes place in on occasions like Davos and many other occasions as well. And look, if you want to go looking for, if you really want to have, you want to put a name to some of these elites, and so of course the quintessential one of the quintessential bad guys would be Bill Gates, right? He's like the quintessential Davos man, the quintessential representative of the elite. And in fact, you start talking about Bill Gates, and someone that has the mindset of the kind of person you mentioned would easily say, oh, here he is talking about Bill Gates again, and it's like, oh yeah, the Bill Gates conspiracy. And I think it's, but when we talk about Bill Gates does exercise a huge influence, and especially over, for example, the World Health Organization. Bill Gates is one of the main funders. He provides more funding to the World Health Organization than most governments. But as it has been admitted by high-level representatives of the WHO itself, this does buy him a lot of influence within the WHO, because a lot of this money is earmarked. It means that then he gets to say how this money is spent, in what research that money is spent. And so, for example, Bill Gates has tended to focus a lot of that research on vaccines. And this is not because he necessarily has some nefarious plan, but because he has ties to a lot of vaccine making companies. He is well invested in a lot of those companies. And more often than not, that it really boils down to profit and power and wealth. It's not about, wild plans like global depopulation and stuff like that. A lot of this boils down to, the main, one of the main drivers in human history, which is the desire to accumulate, wealth and power and fame. And so, saying Bill Gates is, has a disproportionate influence is, I think it's simply a fact. And in a number of other areas, we know that there are, sectors of society that exercise a disproportionate influence. We know that the arms manufacturers exercise a lot of influence over policy when it comes to war and peace. We know that, we saw during the pandemic the influence that big pharma exercises over policymakers. We know the influence that, we've been talking about the media. Well, if you want to talk about collusion, then, everyone should go and look up on Google the Trusted News Initiative. And that's an organization that was set up a few years ago, 2019, I think. And it comprises all the major news organizations, all the major Western news organizations. And that, they explain the reason for creating the Trusted News Initiative as they explain it in terms of, we've got all these new outlets like YouTube and other outlets where people are spreading disinformation, according to them. So we need to fight back against this. And the way we do that is by coordinating among themselves and putting out a single coherent narrative to fight this disinformation. Now, if this isn't what we're talking about is all the major, news outlets admitting, and in fact, boasting about colluding to fight against alternative narratives. And I think we saw that quite clearly during the pandemic, but you see it on a number of issues. The level of the way in which the narrative is harmonized across not only across various national media outlets, but across countries. So it's not just within a country that most newspapers tend to have the same position when it comes to, climate, Ukraine, now Israel. I think, even over the past few days, we didn't get, much plurality in terms of points of view when it comes to this, to the most recent outbreak of violence in Palestine and Israel. But and so the same applies to most issues. And again, this is due to outright explicit collusion. And so I think people need to realize that there is an element, there are converging interests among I think on any issue there's always a convergence of political and economic interests, and there are and these interests sometimes do converge in the form of specific policies. I don't think this is outrageous to claim at all, and I think it's it becomes rather obvious once you start to just to see how power operates in our societies. So it's but I can see why a lot of people are skeptic about this this worldview, and we shouldn't be too extreme about it. I don't think their control is absolute, because otherwise that becomes another form of disillusionment. If we're living in control of this overbearing powers that be, against which we can do nothing, then that can fuel just as much disillusionment as the idea that the world's about to end. I don't believe that at all. I think that power isn't absolute. I think, going back to what I was saying earlier, that their attempts to clamp down and control the internet are bound to fail. I think they'll be able to control the major social networks where most people are on and get their information from, but I don't think they'll be able to exercise complete control over the information that is that comes out of the internet. And I think even these last 2 days, I think it's been really interesting to see just how different the narrative on, especially Twitter. So now, I mean, the main social network, for information and discussion about current events is Twitter, and it's just been really interesting to see how different the narrative on Twitter has been from the one-sided narrative that we've heard from the mainstream media. So I think maybe it's been really the first example of just how much an instrument like Twitter is able to break that stranglehold over the narrative. Of course, they'll try to bring Twitter back under control, but I think new outlets will spring up. So it'll be interesting to see. But I think it's but we are fighting back. I think at various levels, there is a pushback against this.
Can I ask you? Oh, sorry, Thomas. I just want to interrupt you just to ask you one thing on the whole media issue. And I am fearful of the media issue. I've been at least in Australia, here in South Australia in particular, I've been a media commentator on national security, defence, and other matters. Now, I've noticed from the outset of the new Israel-Hamas war that there is a degree of intolerance from what is out there in the media. It's almost as if the gatekeepers have allowed the extremists just to flood out and say the most outrageous things. I mean, outrageous things that even at the height of the bombing campaign in the 1990s, we wouldn't ever get away with saying out in the public domain. But now people are, they're calling Palestinians animals. They're not being nuanced about where the violence is coming from or how it arose. They're just laying it all out there. It's almost as if there's now a bare bones of racism that according to where you are on the pecking order of society or ethnicity or religion, you can get away with bloody murder now, and you couldn't do it before. There is a lack of civility, a lack of rationality, and certainly a lack of tolerance for a centrist analysis point of view, which I think is actually quite frightening, because when we go down the rabbit warren of national security issues, issues of war and peace, well, we touched upon the Ukraine war. I mean, I tend to have my views on that particular struggle, but nonetheless, the idea of being able to rationally view it from all conceivable perspectives, put all your cards on the table, see where the dice is rolling. Basically, if you're rolling the dice, no one is going to be doing that in the future, according to the new rules of the game, which just allow the extremists to flood in from both sides and crowd out the center. That is dangerous stuff. So what do you think about this whole thing with Russell Brand? I mean, again, he's putting himself up as a bit of a torchbearer for a lot of free speech, and I do like watching Russell. I don't agree with everything that he says. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of things that I don't agree with what he says, but I find him entertaining, and I get a bit of a chuckle out of seeing him sometimes. But my right to be able to see him on YouTube has now been proscribed by the faceless corporate elite of YouTube. And now we're looking at him moving into this little outfit called Rumble. I've had a look at it, but I'm not really I'm not very technically inclined, Thomas, so forgive me. I'm not one of those guys that switches technology all over the place. It's hard enough to work out Twitter. But,
it's not technology, Rob.
I'm sure it isn't. I'm sure. And I'm sure on Rumble, they will take freedom of speech to an extreme that I'd probably feel rather uncomfortable with. How do you manage this kind of thing? And is Brand right in the way that he's come out fighting for the survival of free speech? Is he really the torchbearer he makes himself out to be? What are your thoughts?
So, on what you were saying earlier, I agree. I mean, the lack of complexity in current debates is in the mainstream media is really shocking, and I think it's I think if there's, just look at the way, for example, the issue of, so regardless of what one thinks about who's right and wrong in Ukraine. The nuclear issue should be an issue that we take seriously, I think. And in fact, throughout the entire Cold War, it was taken quite seriously. Entire political policy architectures, international architectures were built around the notion that the nuclear threat is real. Look at how the issue is framed now. Oh, we shouldn't worry about, nuclear, Russian nuclear retaliation, because that's never going to happen. So either, all the Cold War planners and politicians were idiots, and the ones that we have now are geniuses,
I doubt that.
or more likely to be the other way around. I think that's just one example, which I find terrifying of just how dangerous this, this hyper simplification of the debate is. Now, if you simply raise the issue of the nuclear risk, you're shitting for Putin, which I find frankly terrifying as a way of approaching these issues, and I think it is very scary. On brand, so of course brand is not perfect, but I mean, I think what I find surreal about the age that we live in is that, I mean, if you listen to Brand and you watch his shows, aside from the put aside the clickbaiting title, which is often just made put there to lure you in. But if you look at the topics he covers, the way he covers those topics, the sources he uses, look, he has a very serious journalistic approach. And in fact, I would say, I think some people would be hard pressed to find an instance where Brand has engaged in just outrageous, conspiracy theorizing, or we're not talking about Alex Jones here, if you know who he is. So, I think it's important to differentiate. I think what Brand is doing now, what Brand has to do on YouTube, is not that dissimilar from the kind of normal work that you would have read, that people like Seymour Hersh and Daniel Ellsberg would have done, would have written in the Washington Post and the New York Times in the 1970s. He uses mostly mainstream sources to shed a light on, analyses and pieces of information and facts that the mainstream media isn't covering. And of course he throws in his opinion now and then, but I would consider what he does journalism, and I think journalism to a higher degree than a lot of the kind of the journalist work that you find in the official mainstream media. So I think that's what I find paradoxical, that here you have a former comedian who is doing a better job covering a lot of the most important issues of our time. He does it from a point of view, but I think most journalists, I mean, the idea of unbiased journalism is,
forget that.
Whenever someone says, they're unbiased, they're simply hiding their bias. So of course he comes from a point of view, as most, just as people like Seymour Hersh and Daniel Ellsberg and others, Bob, Woodward and all these great journalists that we learned to love in the 60s and 70s and 80s and that are still romanticized to this day. They had their own biases, so that they didn't pretend to be unbiased. But I think, with his biases notwithstanding, I think he, and this ex-comedian is doing a better job at journalism than most real journalists. So I think that's my takeaway from this, from this whole story. And they're turning him into an advocate, into a martyr of free speech.
I agree.
He doesn't, he can claim to be one now because he is being censored on the basis of, as of now, allegations that haven't been proven in a court of law. And I think that is also scary in itself. And I think that's one of the kind of most pernicious consequences of the whole Me Too movement, which I think, clearly came, I can see why a lot of women supported that movement, but it has also created this environment where you can destroy someone's life, someone's career, simply on the basis of an allegation, which may very well also be false, as a lot of these allegations have turned out to be. And I think it's very scary. But again, it relates to that, we've lost the ability to think clearly about these issues. I mean, the notion of innocent until proven guilty, and that we should be skeptical of what we read in the papers, and all this is now has been forgotten, and so YouTube can get away with deplatforming someone. And to go back to what I was saying about brand, YouTube is very, very sensitive about what they consider to be disinformation.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they weren't able to deplatform brand as they have deplatformed another great many other commentators, I think points to the fact that there was no outright disinformation, even according to the kind of mainstream definition being put out by brand. Otherwise, they would have shut his channel down. So I think just to confirm what I was saying earlier, but I think the fact that they can shut any channel down simply because someone somewhere said something about you, I find quite terrifying. And one could almost see it as a new form of social control.
Is there some thought? Sorry, Thomas. Is there some sort of a war against the judiciary? I mean, we've seen a war against the judiciary in the United States, where the conservatives have now stacked the benches. They've repealed Roe versus Wade. We're starting to see, we have seen ructions in Israel with Netanyahu wanting to impose the political process onto the judiciary, and the Israelis have a very proud tradition of keeping a separation between the politics and the judiciary for quite some time. I'm starting to see some of that happen in Australia. I see it in the UK. What do you think is going on here? I mean, if we're talking about permacrises, we often talk about the geopolitical consequences of either climate change or war, but we don't talk about the erosion of our rights through the judicial processes. Those processes were put in place to defend the average Joe citizen, but they are not standing up to any form of test now. As soon as political pressure, from whatever avenue, whether it's the Me Too movement or the Rainbow movement or whatever movement happens to be there, there's proliferation of hierarchical elites that are all busy fighting against each other to get into the top dog position. Along the way, we just don't really have any respect for the law. The law ceases to have meaning.
Absolutely, but I think that's what we're witnessing. I think in the West, and but I think this is what we're witnessing. It really is the collapse of Western democracies as we have known them. We've seen the slow, chipping away at all the checks and balances that had been put in place precisely to protect us against abuses of power, and of course the separation of powers was one of the main pillars of that system. But I think we are that has been less and less the case. I think we've seen this. We've seen the walls between those various powers, I think, slowly erode. And I think now, I wouldn't say they've collapsed into each other, to create one single center of power. But I think that's the direction where we are heading. So an increasingly unaccountable state, which tends to exercise its powers in more, less and less restrained ways. I think that's where we are heading. I think, and all the what you mentioned, those are all examples of that, and you can see it happening in pretty much all Western states. It's the immersion of it's a neo-authoritarian form of governance, and I think it and relates to this. To the political exploitation of crisis. It's there's this constant constant resort to states of emergency, which then allow you to bypass the normal channels of democracy. And I see judiciaries in a number of countries becoming increasingly acquiescent towards executive powers, towards government. And, so we are witnessing this growing politicization of the judiciary. Even look at what's happening now in America using the judiciary to go after Trump. I think, regardless of what Trump's responsibilities may be, it's pretty clear that this is a political move. So this is a dramatic, involution of the American political system. This is stuff that you expect to see in South American banana republics, where the government uses the judiciary to go after the opposition candidate. But that's effectively what we're witnessing in America. So I think we're witnessing a profound change in the form of government in a number of Western countries, and it's a form of government that is becoming increasingly authoritarian. And I think that's very worrying, and you see it in every area. You see it in this growing censorship. You see it in this growing politicization of the judiciary. You see it in the use of increasingly, even repressive police measures. We saw that during the pandemic. This militarization of public life. So I think we see it in a number of areas, and it's definitely a very worrying dynamic, which we should be able to debate openly, but precisely because this is happening, we're not even given a chance to debate it openly. So you have this kind of self-reinforcing mechanism where societies get more and more authoritarian, but precisely because they are getting more and more authoritarian, we're not able to discuss what is happening, which simply feeds into that authoritarian cycle. So I think this is worrying, but to end on a positive note, I think, as I said earlier, their control is not absolute. They can't control all free speech. We are witnessing a number of instances where, first of all, more and more people don't believe the official narrative. So you have this absolute level of control, or very over the narrative, not in absolute terms, but over the mainstream narrative. But less and less people trust that narrative. So in a way, they're losing that fight. That doesn't mean no one else has won. It's not yet, but clearly they are losing that fight, and but that does give some hope for the future. That ultimately, these extreme forms of control, of censorship, are self-defeating. So I think we will witness a growing pushback in the near future. And authoritarian systems always tend to fall. They never last forever. So I think we have to remain hopeful in that sense.
Keep up the good fight, Thomas. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights on The Focus.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, John.
Writer and journalist Thomas Fazi. Now on to you. What do you think about today's topic? Are we in a permacrisis beyond our control? Do we need to alter our politics? What are you prepared to give up in order to live in a better world? Please leave your thoughts and comments in the section below. And to our audience, thanks for tuning into the Focus podcast. We hope that you found today's discussion enlightening and thought-provoking. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to us on social media. You can find the Focus on Facebook, referenced on the John Bruni and Sage International LinkedIn pages, and on Twitter, slowly and inexorably morphing into X. Or on the Sage International website, sageinternational.com.au, by clicking the media drop-down menu and hitting podcasts. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and or leave us a review on your favorite platform. My thanks to our stalwart production team of Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart, and to the team at the Ozcast Network. Join us again next time as we continue to delve into the most pressing current affairs issues of our time. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged. I'm John Bruni, and from Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.